Okay.
It's not a mean laugh, though.
It's not a mean laugh. Okay.
No.
Glad y'all are with us. Glad there are people on Facebook with us. We'll have some folks tuning in a little bit. We're a little early, so folks are going to be just a little late looking for us. I've got to finish a little early today, so I can go fill in for invitation time. So I'll buzz out later, and Peg will finish us up with our announcements and prayer request time. So we are going to begin a new study this week. One source I'm using for study could break this study down into 55 weeks. Another one I'm using is more in the area of 25 to 30 weeks. It's probably the one I'll follow. But anytime I typically do expository through a book of the Bible lessons or study like we're getting ready to start, I typically just look at my the headings in my Bible. The chapter headings and so on, and break our lessons down according to how they're just naturally broken through there. And there's 21 chapters in this book, and there's a lot of sections. So I'm not really sure how long this is going to take, and I'm not really worried about it. We're just going to take however long it takes, and we're going to do a good in-depth study of the Gospel of John. So if you have your Bibles, you can go ahead and open to John. Today's just an introduction. To know where we're headed, we have to know what John was thinking and why he wrote. I've studied the book of John all my life, off and on. You know, that we all are familiar with John. He's written things like, "For God so loved the world." He's written things like, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." He's written things that we are familiar with. He's told us he's the only of the gospel writers to give us the conversation between Jesus and Nicodemus. So why did he write the way he wrote? Why did he? What's the context of his writing? So we're going to spend today giving some information on where John was coming from as he wrote, so that we can better understand why he wrote what he did. So John is the first. The first topic is, of course, who did the writing, and we say it's John. There are some scholars, some theories out there that think John was a made-up character, that he was just a figment of some imagination. He was like a ghost writer, and that he was just the premier example of what a disciple or apostle of Jesus would be. So they've kind of made him, but we don't believe that. We know John was a real guy. We believe John, the beloved apostle, the beloved disciple, the son of Zebedee, the brother of James, is the author of this book. What was James and John's nickname?
Sons of Thunder.
Sons of Thunder, which tells you something, I think, about Zebedee. If they're the sons of thunder, he is the thunder, and probably a big burly fisherman type guy. So he tells you something about him. But John was a valued eyewitness of the life of Jesus. He walked with Jesus for 3 years. He was one of his apostles with his brother James and then Peter. The three of them made up the inner circle of Jesus's apostles. Jesus had a large number of disciples who would follow him. They had the hand-picked 12 that he chose, but then among those 12, the three were really his confidants. They were the ones he was the closest to. Some scholars believe, actually, and this is probably the first time I've read this, but as I read it and gave it some thought, it made sense to me. They believe that Jesus and John were actually cousins. You ever heard that before? They believe that their mothers, Mary and John's mother, who I believe was Salome. I'm not. Yeah, they believe they were sisters, and one of the reasons is because from the cross, Jesus asked John to take care of his mother. That was a natural thing a relative would do. So Jesus had other relatives that would have naturally fallen to, but he specifically asked for John to do that. He also believed John would have been related to Jesus, and because he was known by Mary's priestly relatives. Did you know Mary had priestly relatives? Where would we find a discussion that would tell us that Mary, the mother of Jesus, had priestly relatives? Any idea? Luke? What do you mean, Luke?
Luke wrote the genealogy from Mary's side of the family.
Okay, Luke wrote the genealogy from Mary's side of the family, and even beyond that, in the book of Luke, the first chapter, we read about a lady named Elizabeth and her husband Zechariah. Elizabeth is identified as a cousin to Mary. Zechariah is a priest. Right. So if you were in the Awakening service a couple of weeks ago, we had a really good discussion and less sermon on that. But when Jesus was arrested and he was taken in to see the high priest, the scripture tells us Peter had to stay outside, but John was let in because they knew who he was. So the relationship between the priestly folks and John showed that since they knew him, that there's some understanding there that these guys might have been related. Christian tradition indicates that John made the base of his ministry of operations in Ephesus, putting him in proximity to the 7 Asian churches mentioned in the first 3 chapters of the Revelation. We studied Revelation a while back, and you remember the first 3 chapters has those 7 churches listed. John didn't just willy-nilly pick these churches out of thin air. He would have been familiar with these churches, giving influence and leadership to them, and putting him in Ephesus is right in the heart of Asia Minor, where he would have been close to all these churches. So they believe his base of operations was in Ephesus. It's also Christian tradition that he was buried in Ephesus. But who is his audience? If he's in Ephesus, who is his audience as he begins to write? Christianity, it began in the cosmopolitan city of Ephesus around AD 52, and it began with another guy we're familiar with taking the gospel to them, and that would have been who? Sorry? Paul. Thank you. Y'all are awake this morning, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, good. So Paul, according to Acts chapter 19 and verse 10, took the gospel to Ephesus while he was on his missionary journey. Do you realize he stayed in Ephesus for like 2 years? So he was there a while. We sometimes in the Christian church use Paul as an example and someone to identify with when it comes to doing short-term mission trips. But our 10 days or 1 week mission trip, maybe even 2 weeks, is nothing compared to Paul's. Paul's short-term mission trips would have been 2 years. He went to a city, he established a church, he discipled the church, and then he left people in charge. And so there was a large Jewish community there in Ephesus, and it tells us the earliest leadership of their church was put in place by Paul, and that would have been Priscilla and Aquila and Timothy. Timothy was sent back by Paul to be a leader there. There was also a large group of Greek residents who had no Jewish affiliation at all, but they were still influential. So John, in his base of operations there in Ephesus, is writing his gospel. The 3 other gospels have already been written. The synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're already out there. And John is now writing a different kind of gospel about Jesus to his followers. And he knows that he's going to have both a Jewish and a Gentile audience. He frequently explains Jewish customs and Palestinian geography, and he translates Aramaic terms into Greek at least 7 times. For example, he tells us that when the calling of the first disciples happened, chapter 1, verse 41, he says, he first found his own brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," and then in parentheses it says, which means Christ. That's just an example. That's one of the first times that he does an explanation so that those who didn't have Jewish background would be able to understand what they were talking about. So he translates things. He's aware that he has non-Jewish readers. He also presents Jesus as the Word. The Greek word there is logos. It says he presents him and he became flesh, and it's against a backdrop of Greek thought that included Stoicism and Gnosticism. Now, this isn't a philosophy class, but we need to understand a little bit about these views and the beliefs of Stoicism and Gnosticism to better understand the backdrop of the way John wrote his gospel. We'll get to that in just a minute, but John also shows awareness of Jewish readers as he demonstrates Jesus to be the Jewish Messiah, the fulfillment of many Old Testament themes of the Son of God who was sent by God the Father to reveal the only true God and to provide redemption for all of humanity. So what is the importance then of of John writing his gospel and refuting the idea of Stoicism? Well, if we don't know exactly when his gospel is written, we know it's somewhere probably after 70 AD, and there's some thematic and some literary things that's going to give those reasons, and it really doesn't matter to you. But what you need to know is he wrote his gospel, and then these false teachings, these Greek false teachings of Stoicism and Gnosticism started flowing into his churches. So he had to refute those. So he wrote 3 letters. We're very clever at the way we word things and name things. So we call those 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. He wrote these 3 letters back to these churches to defend and to talk about why what they're being taught now is wrong. Then he ends up writing the Revelation. But after he writes these 3 letters, scholars tell us that he also came back and he wrote the prologue, the first 18 verses of the gospel. John chapter 1, verses 1 through 18 were not written in the original translation or the original manuscripts that he sent out to his churches. He came back and added it. He realized after all these things that are happening and these other beliefs are coming in that maybe he wasn't clear enough on exactly who Jesus was. So he wanted to hit it right from the get-go. And the first 18 verses speak directly against Stoicism and Gnosticism. So what did they believe? Stoicism was a philosophical system based on the teachings of Zeno of Citium. That'll be on your test later. Zeno of Citium, he lived between 335 and 263 BC. They suggested a basic view in which everything, including God, nature, and humanity, is of one essence. The goal of the Stoic is to conform to the law of nature. They believed that there was a logos force. Logos is the Greek word that can be translated as word. It can be translated as reason. It's a very logical way of believing the Stoicism is. So they believed there was a logos force of God that flows through nature like an invisible river, animating all things with order and beauty. Sounds very Star Wars-ish to me. May the Force be with you. A wise individual, according to Zeno, would be one who would seek to live in harmony with this force that determines destiny. To resist the law of nature is futile. It's like swimming against the stream. The early church was well aware of the Stoic philosophy, and Luke records in Acts chapter 17 that Paul encountered Stoics in Athens. For Stoics, theology could be deduced logically from observations and impressions of the cosmos. Because it argued that only what was logically deducible could be known, Stoicism rejected the classical Greek pantheon or the classical Greek grouping of gods. In fact, Stoics considered the gods irrational and unworthy. However, because of their emphasis on living a socially ethical life, they could not make a radical break with society and its values. Hang with me. We're hitting somewhere. Stoicism thus affirmed the culture and values of its time while maintaining its belief in a universe that is guided by reason and order, not governed by a creator. In practice, the Stoics did not completely abandon the concept of the divine. They chose to interpret the divine as logos, or the rational principle that governs and develops the universe. Theologically, the logos was seen as guiding all people's fates. This combination of pantheism and apparently divine logos and fate was unique to Stoicism since its concept of God was flexible. So now, in light of what they believed about this logos, this force that was like a river flowing through everything, that God was not only in us or in people, but he was in everything. He was the full essence of it all. So now in light of that, consider the first verse of John 1. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. John decided to take their belief in this reason, this force, and to tell them exactly who that force is. Who is the sustaining director of your fate? It's Jesus himself. He made sure that they understood that this Logos they believed in is a person and that he came. But then so the several verses there, he talks about, he uses the word Logos in the prologue, and he talks about who Jesus was. But then you have the Gnosticism view that he has to go up against. The name derived is from the Greek gnosis, meaning knowledge. Today we even have agnostics. You put the prefix on that, it means no or without knowledge. Agnostics today, the difference between an agnostic and an atheist says there is no God. An agnostic says, well, there's probably some divine being out there, but it has no relevance for me. He's not interested in me, I'm not interested in him. He's just out there. Okay? So Gnostics sought a secret knowledge that was connected with human salvation. Everything in the universe was seen as falling into one of two categories. You had the immaterial or the spiritual realm, okay? And then you had the material universe, things that were made up of matter, okay? So think back to your science days. Tell me what is made up of matter? Everything. This chair, this floor, this building, the walls, the lights, us. That's where I was waiting for somebody to chime in there. We are made up of matter. So according to the views of the Gnostics, anything that was material or flesh would be considered evil. A Gnostic would never expect or believe that a divine God would take on human flesh. Because, after all, human flesh, in and of itself, just the material, is considered evil. So you put that up against what John says in John chapter 1, verse 14. And the Word, the Logos, became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory. Glory as of the Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John is in the first prologue. He is just going up against these two views and nails it down. Takes their beliefs, uses their own words, and turns it on their head. You think you are right in saying that the divine would not do that, but he is divine. So if the divine would not take on evil flesh, what does that say about flesh in and of itself if Jesus was willing to do it? It's not evil. So he's taken these views and he's turning them over. He's making sure his people that he wrote to and that he discipled and that he helped grow aren't going to be led astray by these views that sound good, but they're just a little off. No one can nail down exactly the date John wrote his gospel. John knew he could not be with his followers forever, so he organized the stories he had been sharing about Jesus into written form. Later, when controversy and heresy threatened those under his care and influence, he wrote letters back to those churches and set straight the wrong things they were being taught. It is also believed that it was at this time when the heresies of Gnosticism and Stoicism were invading the churches that he added this that we have come to know as the prologue of the gospel, John chapter 1, verses 1 through 18. He wanted his gospel to contain a direct reference to the divinity of Jesus. He wanted there to be no doubt. He infers throughout the book the whole divinity of Jesus, but he wanted to make sure now you get it from the very beginning. He wanted to make sure his readers knew what he was talking about. He wanted the gospel to contain a direct reference. He wanted to leave no doubt to his reader that Jesus is God in the flesh. So how is the book put together? What is the purpose? Why did he write this gospel? Well, in my days of studying and doing the particular degree I'm working on, and I've had to write a lot of book reviews. And in those book reviews, one of the things we're supposed to find is the purpose of the book, and then discuss whether or not the author of the book maintained his purpose all the way through. Is everything he wrote really going to the purpose of the book, or did he get off track for a little while? Generally, you find that in modern books, in either the preface or in the introduction of the book. He'll tell you why he's written it and why he's doing what he's doing. That's not the case for the Gospel of John. You have to go all the way to the end. John chapter 20, you will find what is known as the purpose of this book. In fact, there are some scholars who believe that this book is written in 4 phases, that John has come back and he's put this book together thematically, and that his book ends at the purpose. They believe John's original writings ended at John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. They believe that another writer has added chapter 21 to it. And one of the reasons they believe that is there is a point where Jesus, the writer uses the pronoun we rather than I. And so they believe someone else has written it. But they believe John ended his book, and if that's the case, if John finished at the end of chapter 20, then verses 30 and 31 are the final 2 verses of the book that tell you its purpose, which to me is backwards. But John says, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." He tells us in verse 31, there are 3 reasons, 3 purposes for him to have written this book for his people. The first 2, these themes are found all the way throughout the book. He tells us that first he wants you to believe that Jesus is the Christ. Jesus is the Messiah, the anointed one. He is the promised one. As we read earlier in John chapter 1, verse 41, he explains that Jesus is the Messiah, that he is the Christ. He makes it very clear right off the beginning. If the prologue was added later, if 1 through 18 was added later, we know that verse 19 then would have been the very beginning of the book. John writes his book very similarly to the other Gospels when he writes, and he starts with the beginning of the ministry of Jesus Christ. He writes that talking about John the Baptist, and then just like the other disciples did, or the other writers did, they talked about, hey ladies, I bet y'all could make it. Better late than never. But you do what you got to do with the choir. I mean, you got to be up there. This thing, I assume, he's in the choir. You went in the choir? Okay. Well, we're glad you're visiting with us today.
I didn't see right there with that yellow, so it must be.
That's true. We're in John. We're beginning, for those of you who are just coming in, we are beginning a study now throughout the book of the Gospel of John. So we're finishing up really the introduction here. But again, Jesus, John. All these J's are going to give me trouble. I am going to misspeak a lot, I have a feeling, through this, because I was thinking, if John is Jesus's cousin, like we said a little ago, and that if y'all missed that, you're going to go back and watch it on the video. But if John and Jesus are cousins, think about this family tree all of a sudden. This is totally free. This is nothing we're talking about. You got Jesus. He has a brother named James. Elizabeth had a son named John. And now there's another John. So they like J's, I guess. It was
their thing.
It was their thing. I know some families who use the same letter all the time when they name their children. Then I know a family who the mothers say what?
I said mine was unintentional.
Yours was unintentional. And then you have the family, the mother's name starts with a T and the dad's name starts with a J, so they went JT, 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 and so, you do whatever you got to do. But we are totally off the point right now. And that's okay.
Rabbit.
Yeah. Okay. Pew, pew. So we talked about, you missed it, we talked about Star Wars earlier. I mean, it's just all kinds of stuff. So, but anyway, these 2 verses, John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, give us the purpose of the book. He wants his reader to believe Jesus is the Christ. He goes back later and he adds the first 18 verses in chapter 1, reminding us that Jesus is the Messiah. He is the Son of God. But more importantly, not only does he, well, not more importantly, but along with it, he wants not only our people to understand that Jesus is the Christ, but also that he is the Son of God. Why does that matter? It's late in the 1st century. John has been sharing and discipling these folks surely he's explained to them one-on-one that Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus is the Son of God. Why now, toward the end of his life, is he writing it down? You don't want them to forget. What else?
It's also more powerful if you put it in words.
Okay, it's powerful. Who?
Is he leaving it if he's making a record for us later on?
I don't, yeah, and of course, we all believe that God inspired the writing of his word. I think the quick and easy answer, Pat, is he's writing it down because he's inspired by the Holy Spirit to do so. I don't think John understood that he was writing this down so that 2,000 years later, we would be able to read it, right?
He probably did accept the fact, though, that he was old and that he wouldn't be around much longer.
Well, even if he didn't know that, this Jesus wasn't gonna come back before the 2,000 years, so he thought that maybe he's coming back in the next 100 years, he could have been just writing it.
Sure.
It's that far.
Sure. I don't think John understood the full grasp of who would be reading this gospel. But he wanted to make sure whoever did understood.
It's kind of like Pastor Kevin was talking about this morning, Satan wants to deceive, and you're already talking about there were teachers coming in that were starting to say things other than what the solid truth of who Jesus is.
Sure, that's right. So he's making sure that the people who follow him, there can be no doubt. There's these other views that are prevalent. We can't allow these other ideas to muddy the waters of who Jesus is. So John has these two major themes right off the bat. That he is the Messiah. He is the one that the Old Testament's prophesied for. And now he is also going to make clear that he's not only a good rabbi, he's not just a good teacher, he is the Son of God. In Nicodemus, in the story of Nicodemus in John chapter 3, we read that Nicodemus comes to Jesus and he says to him, "Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God. For no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him." All the way throughout the book, we are going to find things where John is writing it down. It's he's decided there's no reason to re-spew the same stories that have already been told about him by Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And really it was by Mark, because Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source. That's why you get so many verses that sound exactly the same. So John is doing it a little different. We believe he's using a source, but it's not Mark, it's not Matthew, it's not Luke. And he's going to write from a slightly different point of view because he wants to make sure that both the Greeks who will be reading it and the Jewish people who will be reading it understand that everything they have witnessed, everything that they have shared verbally, can be trusted and emphasized that Jesus is the Messiah and Jesus is the Son of God. He is the God in the flesh. He is divine. Matt Carter in the Christ-Centered Exposition Commentary says, only someone divine could do all that God promised. In the let me try that again. There was no comma there was no period. I just stopped. Only someone divine could do all that God promised in the Old Testament. Only someone divine could be trusted with the absolute power and authority promised to a Messiah. What kind of authority and power was promised to him? All. Is that a fancy word for, just a little bit, or does all, A-L-L means all? So what power or authority did he not have? None. You get it? In fact, I teach a Sunday night class right now on the idea of being a leader, and as Christians, we are all leaders and people of influence. We use our capabilities and our integrity to influence those around us, whether we have a position of leadership or not. We are all leaders. What have you ever? I'm not going to think it'd be somebody in this room. I'm not going to think it'd be somebody watching us on Facebook. But I know there are people out there who cannot handle authority. And I don't mean that it's just too much for them. I mean, you give them just a little authority, you give them just a little power, and what do they typically do with it? They run with it. Yeah. They turn into tyrants. Ooh, that's a word. You know, I wasn't going to use that one. I won't say who said it out loud. We won't put that out there on the air, okay? But they turn.
They think the big dog.
I have opportunities in my life to come across folks who don't have power and authority in any other part of their life, but this one little spot.
Yes.
And whether
They
it's
Barney Fife with that bullet.
that's about right. I mean, I don't want to get too since I'm on Facebook, I'm not going to get too specific. I don't want anybody to really figure out what I'm talking about. But there are folks that just are given just a little authority and they abuse it. Okay? Only the divine, only perfection could be given absolute power and authority. We're going to talk about it tonight. You all might want to tune in or come to the class. We're going to talk about it tonight when Jesus washed his disciples' feet. John tells us, John, same guy we're talking about, the same book we're going to be studying, John tells us in John chapter 13, verse 3, that Jesus, realizing that all power, all things have been given to him by the Father, took off his outer garments, wrapped a towel around his waist, and washed his disciples' feet. What did Jesus do with all of his power and authority? He served. He served. That's the Jesus that John wants to make sure people know. He is the Messiah. He is the Son of God. But the third theme that we'll find, and it permeates the book, is that believing in him brings life. John 1:4, in him was life, and life was the light of men. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, and whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. John 5:24, truly, truly, dilly dilly, I say to you, whoever hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life. He does not come into judgment, but has passed from death to life. John 11:25 through 26, Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me though he die, he shall live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. And then he finishes that with, do you believe this? The fact is true, right? He's laying it out. I'm going to enjoy. That's going to be fun. That's John 11. He's talking to Mary and Martha. This is after Lazarus has died. We're going to have a good, enjoyable time there. That when we discuss that, but he gets all the way through his discussion and he tells her, these are the facts. But the question is, do you believe it? If you don't believe it, what does it mean to believe? I can't get off this, But what does it mean when you believe? When you say, I believe it in my heart, what does the heart represent in the Old Testament and the New Testament, as a matter of fact? Your core, the core of who you are, your decision making, right? If you say, I believe it in my decision making, that means your life is going to express it. You're not just going to say, I have a knowledge. That's when we say, people say, they missed heaven by 18 inches. They had the head knowledge. They knew the facts, but they didn't believe it. They didn't put into practice what they said they knew. Jesus asked her, do you believe it? John 14:6, Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. This is going to be a fun study. We're going to look at John possibly in a way that you've never looked at John before. We're going to keep in mind this idea. Those of you who came in late, you need to go back and watch the video on the discussion of Stoicism and Gnosticism. What? So you have to go back and look at that because we're going to see why he wrote the way he wrote and the things he was writing to help counteract those things. And we're going to look at these three themes, that Jesus is the Messiah, Jesus is the Son of God. Believing him brings us life. Those are is that not the gospel? Do his this way. Okay, good. So that is the gospel. That's where we're headed. So next week we will begin in John 1. But your homework. Your what? Your homework this week is 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. We will be referring to these letters probably as we go through it. It's good that you've read them and they're short. 1st John is like five chapters. 2nd and 3rd John are a chapter ish. I think 2nd John is only one chapter. It might be 2, but I think it's only 1. So you need to read those. It's not going to take you long. Before you come back next Sunday, read through 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John and John 1 through 18. Okay, John 1 through 18, along with whatever else you're reading, because I know you're following your reading plan. So that's where we are. Any thoughts or comments? Those of you on Facebook, it's good to have you with us. We're stopping a little early today. I've got to go upstairs, so I'm glad y'all are with us, and that this is just the introduction. We're gonna start preaching next week. All right, y'all don't want to miss it. It's going to be good. We'll see y'all. If you have any questions, shoot them out to me, and I'll see what I can do about it.
Verses 1 through 18 or
Yes.
chapter? Okay.
Chapter 1, 1 through 18.